The sky over the northern Montana highway was a dull shade of gray. Fragile snowflakes floated gently down, blanketing the towering roadside pines. In the biting cold of a late winter afternoon, the desolate road echoed only now and then with the sound of a passing vehicle, quickly returning to its usual, raw stillness. In this forgotten corner of the world, a sleek black SUV suddenly emerged, gradually slowed down, and came to a stop by the deserted roadside. Its engine idled quietly as if waiting for something. The car door swung open. A man stepped out. His polished leather shoes crunched on the pure white snow, his footsteps sharp in the frozen silence. This was Max Harper, a tall man with a cold face and lifeless eyes that flicked briefly around, checking to make sure no one was watching. He walked to the back of the vehicle, opened the trunk, and silently looked inside. For a fleeting moment, two tiny amber eyes stared back up at him, full of worry, glistening with confusion and overwhelming fear. Two small German shepherd puppies huddled in the corner of the trunk. Their soft fur, barely marked with hints of dark brown on a sleek black coat, trembled in the cold. Barely 3 months old, their frail little bodies had no strength to fend off the threats of the outside world. Pressed tightly against one another, they sought warmth, safety, anything, from the only companion they had left. Max reached in, his hand rough as he grabbed one of the puppies by the scruff, with not a trace of gentleness or mercy. The little pup startled, letting out a soft, pleading whimper. Without hesitation, he walked a few steps to the roadside and set the two puppies down on the icy snow. They instinctively curled up, shivering from the cold and terror. Their young eyes stared up at him in desperate confusion, silently begging for help, for a shred of kindness. But Max simply turned and walked away, not once looking back. The car door slammed shut with a harsh finality. The SUV roared to life and sped off, leaving only the deep tire tracks in the snow, and the two abandoned puppies on the side of a lonely road, beneath a sky that was growing darker and heavier by the minute. Now all they had was each other. The freezing wind howled around them. They crept closer together, curling into a shivering ball, clinging to the last remnants of warmth. Their sleek fur grew damp and cold. Their tiny ears folded back. Their eyes drooped from fatigue, from the hunger and bitter cold. One of them, marked with a lighter brown patch on its front leg, gently licked the other's face, a tender gesture of comfort. Amid fear, they tried to console each other with the little love they had left. Minutes passed, heavy and slow, like stones pressing down on their small, fragile bodies. They listened for sounds from the highway, hoping someone might stop, might reach out and rescue them, but all in vain. Their vision dimmed, and their strength faded under nature's ruthless grip. Yet no matter how weak or weary they became, the two puppies never left each other's side. They clung to one another as if this bond was the only thing keeping them alive, the last thread tying them to life. As darkness settled fully, covering the freezing world in shadow, the two puppies huddled close, trembling, waiting for a miracle. But could such a miracle happen in a place so cold, so empty, where human compassion seemed to have vanished into the winter's cruel void? Not far away, a pair of headlights slowly approached, weaving through snow-laden trees. But would that vehicle stop? Or would it be just another flicker of hope, gone in a blink, leaving the two tiny souls behind in the frozen dark? Only time will tell. But one thing was certain. Those two little German shepherds, fragile and suffering, were still fighting to survive, driven by the fierce instinct of their kind, and by a faith in human kindness they had never yet received. The headlights of the pickup truck rolled slowly forward, cutting through the snowy branches along the roadside, revealing the lonely figures of the two puppies still huddled together. The truck eased to a stop, its old engine rattling gently before falling quiet just a few yards away from the trembling pups. Behind the wheel, Michael Brooks took off his tinted glasses and squinted through the veil of snow. He hadn't planned to stop here. He only wanted to make it back to his small house before dark. But something, maybe the instincts of an old soldier, or perhaps some deeper pull, had made him break. A vague suspicion had stirred in him moments earlier when he saw an SUV speed away in a hurry. He stepped out, pulling the collar of his worn coat higher to block the wind, and slowly approached the place where that suspicious scene had just occurred. Michael was nearly 55, his silver-flecked hair dusted with snow. His face was calm, etched with a quiet sorrow, like a man who had lost more than he could ever speak of. A seasoned combat veteran, his deepest scars weren't visible on the surface but buried deep in his heart, wounds time still hadn't healed. His steps slowed as he heard a faint whimper carried on the wind. He squinted, and his heart clenched when he saw the two tiny forms trembling in the snow. As he got closer, Michael's eyes softened. All suspicion melted into sorrow as he realized they'd been abandoned, left to die. Their eyes met his, full of helplessness and dread. He knelt gently, careful not to frighten them. His deep, warm voice broke through the cold. "It's okay now, little ones. Don't be afraid." The puppies flinched. The one with the light brown patch on its leg crept forward slightly, as if trying to shield the smaller, weaker one behind it. That moment broke Michael's heart. In that puppy's eyes, he saw the purest form of love and loyalty this world had to offer. Slowly extending his hand, he stroked the shivering puppy's head, feeling the faint warmth of its tiny body. He let out a soft sigh. They were so young, so fragile, so wounded. He knew that if he left them here for even a few more hours, they likely wouldn't survive the night. The image of the SUV came back to him, quietly fleeing the scene. Who could be so heartless, so indifferent, as to abandon these defenseless lives in a snowstorm? Why are people capable of such cruelty? The questions haunted him, echoing memories of the battlefield, of lives lost before his eyes, lives he couldn't save. That pain weighed heavy, and now it gave him a sense of duty, not just toward these pups, but toward all the lives he once couldn't protect. This was a debt he could still pay, a promise he could still keep. With calm determination, Michael unwound the wool scarf from his neck and gently wrapped it around the puppies, cradling their fragile bodies close to his chest. His voice, husky and gentle, whispered, "It's all right now. You're going to be okay. I'm taking you out of here." The pups snuggled into his chest, their trembling eased just a little, their breathing steadying in the haven of his arms. Michael rose, holding them tightly, carefully making his way back to the waiting truck. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or if what he was doing was right or wrong, but he knew one thing for certain. These two little lives needed him. They needed a hand to reach out. They needed a heart that could still feel compassion. As the old pickup rumbled back into the snowy haze, Michael looked down at the two puppies sleeping peacefully beside him, and something warm bloomed in his chest. Maybe he had been right to stop. Maybe he had done the only thing he could, because sometimes life gives you just one chance to do the right thing, and he believed he'd taken it. Outside, snow still blanketed the world in white, but inside Michael's heart, a soft light flickered, an ember of hope breaking through the cold. Michael's old pickup truck moved quietly through the thick curtain of falling snow, its dim headlights cutting a faint path through the dense fog that blanketed the empty road ahead. Inside the cab, the engine's steady hum blended with the soft breathing of the two puppies curled beside him. Nestled in a worn wool scarf, the little dogs began to feel the warmth seeping in from the truck's aging heater, slowly pushing back the bitter cold pressing in from all sides. Michael glanced down at the sleeping puppies, a deep ache swelling in his chest. The image of their small, helpless bodies, left to die in the freezing snow, had etched itself into his mind. And now, the heart of a man hardened by war felt strangely tender. They were far too young to face the indifference of this world, far too fragile to bear the cruelty of abandonment in the dead of winter. In the dim glow of the dashboard lights, Michael's eyes drifted to the small photo taped just above the controls. It was an old picture of him and his late wife, Anna, taken one autumn day many years ago. Her gentle smile remained vivid in his memory. And just then, her voice echoed through his mind. Soft, warm, unforgettable. Michael, always do what's right even when it's the hardest thing to do. Her words were like a breeze, light and quiet, but they carried a strength that had guided him through the darkest chapters of his life. The pain of war had closed his heart and made him colder with each passing year. But at that moment, looking at the two fragile little souls asleep beside him, Anna's voice returned louder than ever, awakening a deep instinct to protect, to care, to shelter. Michael looked down again at the puppies, their tiny bodies still trembling slightly, their breathing shallow but steady. His resolve hardened. He couldn't turn away now. He couldn't ignore this responsibility. His past had taught him that the greatest regret wasn't making the wrong choice. It was failing to act when you had the chance to do something right. He exhaled quietly, reaching out to stroke the soft fur of one puppy. It stirred slightly, nudging its head into his hand, seeking warmth, seeking the safety that only he could provide now. And in that instant, Michael knew the decision was made. There was no hesitation left. He would save these puppies. He would give them a chance to live, to feel love, to know the loyalty and kindness they deserved. The truck continued through the frozen night, heading toward the small wooden cabin where Michael had lived alone for many years. It was a place he had chosen to escape the world, to hide from the ghosts of war. But now he knew that home would no longer be empty, no longer silent. Bringing these two dogs home would change his life, and maybe, just maybe, begin to heal a wound he'd long thought would never close. Driving through the white veil of snow, Michael allowed himself a small smile, for the first time in years, one that wasn't tinged with bitterness or exhaustion. It was a true smile, born of clarity because he knew this was the right thing to do, not just for the puppies, not just for the promise he made to the woman he had loved, but for his own heart, a heart that was finally, slowly, starting to heal, thanks to two little lives that had stumbled into his world. The old pickup wound its way down the narrow path that led to Michael's cabin, tucked deep in the snow-covered pine woods. Inside the truck, the soft warmth from the creaky heater lulled the two puppies into a peaceful sleep. The dashboard cast a faint glow, illuminating their small forms curled up against his side. Michael's eyes drifted from the road, settling on them, and suddenly, his thoughts were pulled backward. The memories came gently at first, then with a force that crashed through his chest like waves. He remembered the war, those brutal years when life and death hung on the edge of every breath. He had been a brave soldier once, burning with courage, fierce in his duty to protect his brothers in arms. But war, as always, was crueler than courage could ever be. It forced him to watch the people he cared about fall, one by one, without being able to stop it. Now, in the quiet stillness of the winter forest, Michael remembered Jack, his closest comrade. Jack had been young, full of fire, always wearing a crooked grin even in the darkest hours. Michael could still see Jack's eyes during that fateful battle, eyes filled with trust, with hope, and it was that look, burned into his soul, that had never let Michael forget. That day, the fight was fiercer than any before. Smoke and fire devoured the sky. Chaos reigned. Michael had tried, God, he had tried, to save Jack. But he couldn't. As Jack collapsed before him, Michael could do nothing but hold his friend close, the blood and dust mixing with tears he hadn't even realized were falling. That loss had haunted him ever since, followed him into every night, every silence. For years, he'd blamed himself, wondered what more he could have done, asked the same questions over and over, only to be met with the cold silence of memories that offered no answers. The guilt had hollowed him out, leaving a cold space that never seemed to fill. Now, as he glanced at the two puppies beside him, that same ache flared to life. But this time it didn't paralyze him. It pushed him to act. Michael realized that he couldn't change the past, but he could do something now. He could save these small lives the way he had always wished he could save Jack. The puppies lay pressed against one another, their soft fur rising and falling with each breath. They slept soundly, trusting completely in the warmth and safety that Michael had given them. He looked at them, his eyes softening. That trust, pure, unconditional, reminded him of the bond between soldiers, of the sacred loyalty shared by those who fight side by side. Michael reached out, gently brushing the head of one puppy. It stirred, nudging its head into his hand, seeking protection, offering silent thanks. At that moment, something inside him melted. The ice that had long encased his heart began to crack. He whispered, barely audible, as if speaking to the dogs, to himself, and maybe to Jack, wherever he might be now. "I promise you, little ones, this time I won't let anything hurt you. I'll protect you, like I should have protected Jack." The truck rolled deeper into the forest, its trail of exhaust fading into the night. But inside Michael's heart, something had changed. The dark weight of his memories was beginning to lift, making space for something gentler. Hope, love. The quiet strength of loyalty was rediscovered in the eyes of two tiny, sleeping dogs. He understood, now more than ever, that this wasn't just a rescue for them. It was a rescue for himself, for a soul long adrift in solitude and sorrow. And for the first time in years, Michael felt something powerful, something healing. His heart, long frozen by regret, was beginning to thaw, warmed by the presence of two fragile lives that had unknowingly saved him. The tires rolled steadily over the snow-covered path, guiding Michael's old pickup closer to the small wooden cabin nestled deep within the stillness of the forest. The faint light from the headlights filtered through frost-covered branches, casting a pale, cold glow over the quiet landscape. Michael exhaled slowly, the weight of his war memories easing just slightly. He glanced at the two sleeping puppies beside him, his eyes full of care and gentleness. Stopping the truck in front of the cabin, Michael stepped out, feeling the soft snowflakes settle into his silver-streaked hair. The cabin and its surroundings were blanketed in white, a silent, desolate beauty. He quietly opened the truck door, reaching for the soft wool blanket always kept on the back seat. Carefully, he wrapped it around the two small puppies. Their fur was still damp and cold, and their weak breaths made Michael's chest tighten with worry as he cradled them close. He stepped gently up the creaking wooden porch and pushed open the cabin door. A wave of familiar warmth welcomed them in. In the corner of the room, Buddy, the old dog who had been Michael's companion for many years, slowly rose. His tail wagged in a slow rhythm when he saw his old friend return. His aged but sharp eyes immediately noticed the two unfamiliar little creatures in his human's arms. Michael set the puppies down in front of the fireplace. The soft orange glow of the fire lit up their trembling bodies. Still cold and damp, the little dogs huddled close together. Their eyes, barely open, flickered with exhaustion and fear. Buddy approached slowly, his gaze quiet and curious. He gently sniffed the puppies, offering a friendly greeting with his weathered nose. Michael smiled softly, reaching down to stroke Buddy's head. "Old friend, looks like we've got company. These two need us more than ever right now." He stood and poured some warm coffee from the thermos. It wasn't ideal for such fragile pups, but survival came first. They needed heat, however they could get it. Michael dipped a fingertip in the warm liquid and gently touched it to each puppy's lips. At first, they flinched, startled by the sensation. But then, driven by instinct, their tiny tongues began to weakly lick the warmth from his finger, struggling to absorb what little strength they could. Michael carefully dried their wet fur with a soft towel. The same hands that had once held weapons were now slow and delicate, treating the pups with reverence, as if they were the most sacred beings in the world. He wrapped them in another blanket and stroked their backs gently, his gravelly voice full of comfort and reassurance. "You're safe now, little ones. Everything's going to be okay." As if they could feel the sheltering warmth of this stranger's presence, the puppies stopped trembling. Their breath steadied. Their eyes, once wide with panic, now slowly closed in the safety of this rare peace. Buddy lay down beside them. Though old, his body still radiated warmth, a perfect source of comfort. The two puppies pressed into his side. His eyes met Michael's with deep understanding, as if to say he knew exactly what was happening, why Michael had chosen to save these two lives. Michael sat beside the fire, quietly watching the flames. For the first time in many years, his heart felt a strange peace. Saving these tiny lives wasn't just the right thing to do. It was also a chance to reclaim a part of himself, a chance to begin healing a soul that had been frozen for far too long. At that moment, Michael silently thanked fate for leading him down that snowy road. He knew hard days lay ahead, but he didn't regret the choice he'd made. Deep in his heart, he understood that by saving these helpless little creatures, he was also saving himself, rescuing a heart buried under years of pain and silence. Outside, the snow kept falling, but inside the cabin, warmth had returned. Not just from the fire, but from compassion, kindness, and the flicker of hope. A new chapter in Michael's life had begun, one filled with meaning, born from a hard decision, but right. The next morning, as the first sunlight pierced through the snowy pines and shimmered against the frosted window of the cabin, Michael still sat beside the fire. He hadn't slept all night, not because he couldn't, but because he didn't want to look away from the two puppies curled up against Buddy's warm body beneath a worn blanket. Bathed in the firelight, the soft rise and fall of their breathing reassured him. The one with the lighter patch of fur on its leg twitched its ears, while the weaker sibling stretched gently and let out a faint, peaceful sigh. Michael smiled, his heart swelling with relief. They were still with him. Fragile, yes, but clinging to life. Still, a lingering unease tugged at his thoughts. That black SUV from the night before, its sudden appearance, the man's cold eyes, the rushed escape down a deserted road. None of it sat right. Something was wrong. He stood up and pulled on his heavy coat, casting one last glance at Buddy and the pups before stepping outside. The wind sliced under the cabin's eaves, but Michael didn't hesitate. He needed help, and he knew exactly who to turn to first. Just 5 miles away lived Sarah Evans, his longtime neighbor and trusted friend. A woman in her early 40s, widowed, lived with 3 cats and a small flock of chickens. She was the kind of person who, if you knocked on her door at midnight, would make you hot cocoa and ask if you were hungry before asking what you were doing there. Warm, direct, and fiercely protective of animals. When Michael's truck pulled up beside her wooden fence, Sarah was already on the porch in a colorful scarf and sweater sleeves rolled up. She smiled at the sight of him, her eyes warm but curious. "Michael Brooks, you're not exactly a morning visitor. What's going on?" she asked, stepping forward as he climbed out. Michael nodded, his face serious but his eyes resolute. "I need a favor. I found 2 abandoned puppies last night. Just babies. Barely made it through the cold, but there's something about how it happened that worries me. This wasn't some random drop-off. Someone meant to leave them. Could be tied to trafficking or poaching." Sarah paused, her expression sobering. "Are you sure?" Michael's voice dropped. "Black SUV. No front plates. Took off fast. Something's off. I need you to call Will Morrison. I know you still talk to him." "Will?" She nodded right away. "He's been heading up wildlife protection for the past few weeks. I'll call him now." She didn't ask anything further. Turning back inside, she made the call while Michael stood quietly under the porch, eyes scanning the snow-laced forest. The tension in his chest hadn't eased. If these puppies were part of something larger, some operation, there were more lives in danger. Minutes later, Sarah returned with a firm look. "Will's coming this afternoon. He said there have been rumors, dogs disappearing near here, but no proof. Maybe this time we'll have something solid." Michael nodded, gripping the cuff of his coat. "Let's hope it's enough to reopen the file." Sarah stepped closer, her tone softer. "You did the right thing, Michael. Not many people would stop in a snowstorm for 2 forgotten puppies. Anna would be proud." At her name, Michael's face fell quiet for a moment. But he nodded gently. "I just did what anyone should have done, and I'm not stopping here." Before he left, Sarah handed him a small bag. Warming gloves, some antibiotic ointment, and 2 old scarves. Thought the little ones might need them. Michael took the bundle, eyes misting slightly. In this frozen world, gestures like that felt like firewood to a fading flame. He returned to the truck, dipped his head in quiet thanks, and drove off, the truck disappearing into the white veil of morning. As the cabin came back into view, Michael knew more challenges were ahead. But at least he wasn't alone. And deep in his soul, he knew, as long as the world still had people like Sarah and hearts like Buddy's, filled with empathy, then those puppies, and he, still had a chance to live, to be loved, and maybe, just maybe, to find their way home again. The pickup truck slowly turned back onto the snowy road leading to the cabin, its tires skimming lightly over a thin layer of ice that had formed under the pale midday sun. In Michael's heart, the meeting with Sarah felt like a brief warmth in a long winter. But as he returned to the cabin, he knew the real challenges still lay ahead. The sky darkened quickly as if dusk had come early. A cold wind began howling through the forest, flinging snowflakes against the cabin walls. Michael tightened his coat as he opened the door and stepped inside, instantly embraced by the faint warmth still lingering from the smoldering fire. Yet the air was still dry and cold, and more than that, it held the fragile presence of the 2 tiny puppies curled in their blankets by the hearth. Buddy lifted his head when Michael returned, his loyal eyes filled with understanding and quiet alertness. Michael stepped forward, kneeling beside the puppies, gently placing his hand on each of their backs. They were still warm, but only barely, like candle flames flickering just before they go out. The older pup, the one with the brown patch on its shoulder, breathed slowly, its eyes fluttering as it sensed the familiar touch. The smaller one was nearly motionless, its ears twitching only slightly at the soft crackle of the fire. Michael pulled out the wool scarf Sarah had given him, wrapping it carefully around the puppies like a final shield. He knew this night was the threshold, the border between life and death. If they made it through, there would be hope. Without wasting time, Michael added more firewood and then boiled water on the old stove. He found an old jar of darkened honey and mixed it with diluted powdered milk, the only thing he could safely feed their empty, delicate stomachs. He soaked the corner of a clean cloth in the warm liquid and gently pressed drops of it to the pup's lips. The older pup tried to lick at the mixture, weak but determined. Michael patiently repeated the motion, drop by drop. He placed a hand on the smaller pup's chest. Its heartbeat was still there, but faint. Time passed achingly slow. Every gust of wind rattling the cabin felt like a threat, waiting to steal away the last bits of warmth. Michael stayed by the fire all night. He rotated the logs, reheated the milk, and made sure the puppies stayed pressed against Buddy. 3 bodies sharing warmth just to survive. Buddy, as if fully aware of his role, lay still and stretched out to provide as much heat as he could. Every time one of the pups stirred or took a deeper breath, Buddy would lift his head to check, then lie back down, never blinking. There were moments when Michael nearly collapsed from exhaustion. But each time his eyelids grew heavy, he looked over at those tiny, trembling bodies and forced himself to rise again. Not because he believed he was some kind of hero, but because he couldn't bear the thought of losing another life under this roof. Not again. And then, just before dawn, when the night felt coldest and the fire had faded to glowing coals, The weaker pup suddenly let out a deep breath and stirred. Michael sat up, startled, watching as the tiny body stretched and its cloudy eyes slowly opened. Then, with a Herculean effort, the pup extended its tongue and touched the milk-stained cloth in his hand. A spark lit in Michael's eyes. No words, no tears, just that one moment, and he knew they had chosen to live. Outside, the wind still howled and the snow still fell, but something inside the cabin had changed. A new warmth had been lit, not just physical, but something fragile and strong at once, like the creatures now nestled together by the hearth. Michael knew they had made it through the first night. Not just the puppies, but himself, and Buddy too. Together they had crossed a line, and on the other side, there was hope. The journey, however, had only just begun. The next morning, the first light of dawn touched the frozen lake in the distance. Pale sunlight streamed through the snowy mist, painting the cabin's damp wooden porch in soft gold. Inside, Michael still sat beside the fireplace, where the embers glowed gently after burning through the night. In his arms, the puppies no longer trembled violently. Their breathing was slow, faint, but steady. The older one, with the brown patch on its shoulder, twitched its paw in sleep. The smaller one, still the more fragile of the two, nudged closer to Buddy, seeking warmth in a way that spoke of survival more than comfort. Michael ran a hand gently over their backs, feeling the slow, persistent rhythm of life like a flickering flame that had survived the storm. But he knew deep down, what he'd done so far, though full of heart, was only temporary. They needed more. They needed knowledge. Expert care. Someone who could understand every twitch, every fragile heartbeat still whispering in their tiny bodies. The sound of an approaching vehicle echoed faintly across the snow, a signal Michael had been waiting for. Buddy raised his head, ears alert. Michael stood, grabbed his coat, and stepped out into the cold, crunching over the thin layer of fresh snow toward the path. A silver SUV emerged through the trees, tires whispering over the ice before coming to a stop at the forest's edge. The door opened, and the first person out was Will Morrison, solid and steady, with the quiet seriousness of a veteran ranger. His eyes were intense, but kind. "Sarah told me everything," Will said, striding up to shake Michael's hand, a firm grip that spoke of shared worry. "And I brought the best person I know." Another car door shut, and a calm, gentle voice followed. "Hi there. You're Michael, right?" The woman stepped forward, carrying a heavy canvas bag. She wore thin gloves, her hair tucked neatly under a knit cap. Her hazel eyes sparkled with sharp awareness, but behind them was a softness, compassion that hadn't been dulled by the pain she'd seen. This was Emily Carter, a veterinarian Will had called in on short notice. Michael nodded in greeting, and as their eyes met for a moment, he realized she wasn't there because it was her job. She was here because she believed in doing what was right. "They're inside," Michael said simply, leading them across the snow, following Buddy's prints from earlier that morning. Inside, the fireplace still burned softly, its glow like a heartbeat keeping the cold at bay. Emily knelt beside the puppies, gently removed her gloves, and laid her skilled hands on their soft, damp fur. Her eyes softened as she watched their tiny movements. Small, barely noticeable, but unmistakable signs of life. The older one still has strength. He responds well to touch and temperature. The little one heartbeat is weak, signs of dehydration and possible hypothermia, she murmured, her hands moving expertly from joints to chest to belly. "But there's still a chance. They're both fighting, and that's what matters most." She opened her medical bag, mixed electrolytes, prepared a warm, saline injection, and carefully slipped a fine needle beneath the skin of the smaller pup. Michael watched her work. There was a quiet elegance in her care, a kind of calm that said this wasn't just medicine. It was belief. "How did you keep them alive through the night?" Emily asked, eyes still on her patient. Michael shrugged slightly. "Kept the fire going, Let Buddy stay close. I didn't leave them. Not for a second. She smiled softly, a silent acknowledgement. That's enough to save a life. Sometimes that's all it takes, someone who doesn't walk away. Will stood by the door, silent but watchful. Something was shifting in the cabin. Not just the pup's slowly strengthening breaths, not just the steam rising from the ginger tea Sarah had sent along in a thermos, but something deeper. The sense that something real was being restored here. Once again, Buddy moved beside them, settling near Emily as she continued her work. No barking, no sound, just a steady gaze and a calm presence. Emily glanced at him, then looked up at Michael. "What's his name?" "Buddy," Michael replied. She nodded with a quiet grin. "Then today, Buddy's our veterinary assistant." And just like that, in a small wooden cabin tucked deep in a frozen forest, a war-scarred man, a compassionate vet, an old loyal dog, and 2 fragile puppies who had nearly died. All of them, in their way, found each other. Not by chance, but by something greater. A chance not just to heal the animals, but to heal themselves. And to believe, once again, that goodness still lived in this world. Outside, the sky had turned a dull leaden gray, and flurries of snow drifted through the treetops around the cabin. Inside, the flickering firelight danced across Emily's face as she leaned forward, checking the breathing of the smaller puppy. Buddy stood alert nearby, while Michael remained silent, watching every precise yet gentle movement of Emily's hands. The flicker of hope had begun to glow more clearly, but just as it started to feel real, an unfamiliar sound echoed from the distance. It was faint, but it didn't belong to the natural rhythm of the forest. A low, rumbling engine. One Michael didn't recognize, not local, not routine. He rose instantly, his posture shifting from calm to alert in a second. Moving quickly to the window, he parted the frosted curtain just enough to peer out. Through the misty glass and between the rows of trees, a light crept forward. Slow, quiet, deliberate. A black SUV, the same type he'd seen that night. He turned sharply to Will, voice low but urgent. "They know I took the dogs. They're coming." Will immediately pulled out his radio, trying to call the nearest ranger station, but the signal was weak. Static and interference drowning his voice. The snowstorm was rolling in harder now. Communication was slipping away. Emily pulled the 2 puppies close, wrapping them in extra blankets and heated pads. Her eyes met Michael's, not with panic, but with calm resolve. "They can't take them," she said firmly. "They're too weak. If they're moved now, they won't survive." Michael nodded. "Then we don't let that happen." He moved with swift, practiced motions, drawing the thick curtains shut, dimming the lights, and adding more wood to the fire to keep it warm without giving away too much glow. Will retrieved a hunting rifle from the truck and checked each round with quiet expertise. Buddy stood at the door, muscles tense, a deep, low growl rising from his chest. Outside, the engine cut off. Then, the sharp thud of car doors. A voice called out, calm but threatening, carried on the rising wind. "We know you have something that doesn't belong to you." Michael didn't respond, but his eyes stayed fixed through the narrow gap of the door. 3 men, each dressed in faded camouflage. One of them was the same man he had seen the night the puppies were abandoned. Max Harper. His hand gripped a handgun tightly, and his gaze, sharp as a blade, scanned silently around the cabin. Will leaned in slightly, whispering into Michael's ear. "They don't have a warrant. If they step inside, they're breaking the law." "But dogs don't wait for warrants," Michael replied quietly, his voice as cold as the frost on the window pane. Inside the cabin, Emily wrapped the 2 puppies in thicker blankets, pulling them close to Buddy and surrounding them with warm water bottles. Her voice was soft, like speaking to children. "Shh, it's all right. You're not going anywhere." A knock echoed at the door, polite but heavy with pressure. Michael stepped forward, blocking the entrance with his tall frame. No weapon in hand, but his eyes alone were enough to stop anyone from making a move. Max spoke, his voice smooth but cold. "You've got something that belongs to us. We just want to take it back." Michael replied, firm, leaving no room for negotiation. "What you left to die on a frozen roadside. I don't think you have the right to call that yours anymore." Silence fell. The wind roared louder, driving snow against the porch roof like a warning. Inside, the fire flared briefly, as if guarding something sacred. Max took a slow step forward. Instantly, Buddy growled, a deep, resonant sound rising from his chest. It wasn't a bark. It was a warning, a promise. "Cross this threshold and you'll pay the price." For a moment, Max froze. His eyes shifted, from Buddy to Michael, and something in his expression changed. He realized this wasn't just a remote cabin. This wasn't a man easily intimidated. With a voice half threat, half mockery, Max muttered, "This won't be the last time we meet." Then he turned, signaling his two men to back off. Boots crunched on the snow. The SUV engine started again, and the vehicle disappeared into the whiteout of the approaching storm. Michael stood at the door for a long while, not moving until the last trace of the SUV's sound had vanished. He clenched his fist, not from fear, but from the weight of the threat he'd just faced. He understood now. This was bigger than he thought. But once you choose to protect, there is no turning back. He stepped inside. Emily looked up, eyes still bright. Buddy remained beside the puppies, unmoving. Michael nodded. This is just the beginning. And everyone understood. This wasn't just a fight for two puppies. It was a stand for something far greater, for compassion and for the right to live, for those who can't speak, but still believe in the good inside humanity. The afternoon sky quickly sank into a heavy shade of graphite, and the snowstorm that had loomed all morning was now a full-blown reality. Gusts of wind, sharp as blades, lashed against the wooden cabin, howling through the eaves like nature's own menacing chant. Or perhaps the whisper of men with cruel intent. Inside, Michael slammed the door shut after the strangers had retreated, securing it tightly with an old, thick beam. But the unease inside him hadn't lifted. Will stood by the window, his weathered eyes scanning every flicker of light beyond the forest line, places where footprints, flashlights, or the silhouettes of returning men might hide in the dark. No one in the cabin spoke aloud, but all three understood. This wasn't over. Max Harper wasn't the kind of man to let go, and what he had left behind on the roadside wasn't out of neglect. It was because he believed no one would be foolish enough to stop in the heart of a deadly winter. Emily sat close to the fireplace, cradling the two small dogs who were still dozing, finally warm and stabilized after hours of fluids and care. The dim orange light flickered on her face, revealing a strange, serene kind of resolve. The kind of strength that didn't come from bullets or force, but from a heart capable of loving without limits. Buddy lay close by her side, ears perked, eyes locked on the darkness as if he could already sense the danger creeping back. Michael stepped forward and placed an old hunting rifle, stored deep in a wooden chest since the war, on the table. He wiped down each sight and bolt with steady hands that no longer trembled. His eyes were cold now, but in that calm lay something more formidable than any weapon. The will of a man who had nothing left to lose. "They won't come back during the day," Will muttered, almost to himself. "If they make a move, it'll be when the storm is at its worst, when no one can help." Michael nodded. "Then we don't wait." He and Will moved quickly to recheck every possible entry. The back door was braced with the strongest planks they had. Windows were sealed shut, boarded, and insulated with a thick cloth to block both cold and light. The cabin, small but built solid by Michael's father back in the day, had once withstood forest storms, grizzly bears, and avalanches. Now it stood as a temporary fortress for a fight none of them had chosen. By midnight, just as they had expected, the first sounds came. Not footsteps, but the slick rumble of shifting snow, hidden within the howling wind. Then came the crunch, deliberate, measured steps sinking deep into the snow. A flashlight beam flashed across a fogged window pane. Michael crouched low, silently moving toward the kitchen window. Will waited opposite him, rifle raised and loaded. Emily kept the two little dogs close, one arm wrapped tightly around Buddy, saying nothing. A soft metallic click echoed from the back door. Someone was testing the lock. Michael said nothing, only nodded once. A faint creak of straining wood followed. Then a loud crack. A heavy boot smashed the back door wide open, and 3 figures stormed in, like the darkness itself had flooded into the room, dimly lit only by the fire's low glow. For a second, time froze. And then came a roar, not human, but a hoarse, primal snarl from deep in Buddy's throat. No one had time to react. Buddy launched himself at the front man, Max. The force of the impact sent him crashing to the wooden floor, his gun clattering out of reach. In the chaos, Michael charged, unarmed but powerful, slamming the second intruder to the ground just as he crossed the threshold. Will covered them from behind, rifle aimed, voice commanding, "Stop! You've crossed the line!" The third man hesitated when he saw the gun aimed directly at him. He raised his hands slowly, uncertain. Emily had already pulled the 2 puppies into the corner behind her, eyes locked on Michael. Not in fear, but with unwavering trust. In that flickering moment between life and death, Max lay sprawled on the floor, scratched and seething with rage. He bellowed, "Those dogs are mine! You have no idea how much they're worth!" Michael knelt beside him, his voice low, but each word sharp and deliberate, cutting through the storm. "Number, they don't belong to anyone, and you're not worthy of having a single living soul by your side." Silence fell. Only the wind and their ragged breathing filled the tiny cabin. Will stepped in with handcuffs, restraining the 3 intruders while calling in the rangers over the emergency channel. Luckily, the signal had returned as the storm began to ease. The poachers had finally been brought down, not by guns, but by the courage of 3 people and 1 old dog who refused to bow. When the cabin fell quiet again, Emily returned to the little dogs, gently touching their foreheads. Their breathing was steady, their eyes fluttering open again. Survival instinct now confirmed by a battle fought without a single drop of blood, but soaked in sweat and resolve. Michael slumped down by the fire, back resting against the timber wall, eyes on the glowing embers. He reached out and ran a hand along Buddy's head, his voice hoarse but thick with emotion. "We held the line, old friend." And in that warm space, once just a lonely winter cabin, something greater now took root, a symbol of quiet bravery, of love without conditions, and life, fragile, yes, but always worth defending to the very end. As the storm in the forest gradually faded and the suffocating darkness retreated after the tense confrontation, the small cabin sank into a heavy silence. The fireplace crackled steadily in the corner, casting soft amber light across the wooden floor still marked by the scuffle. The intruders had been handcuffed and taken away by the late-arriving ranger team, leaving behind a room filled with exhausted breaths and tension not yet at rest. Emily remained seated near the fire, her gaze fixed on the 2 puppies now fast asleep in a nest of woolen blankets and thermal lining. In the glow of the flames, their fur began to regain its natural glossy brown. Their breathing had grown deep and steady, replacing the faint, shaky gasps from just days ago. Buddy lay just behind them, a silent guardian, his presence warm and constant, shielding the tiny lives he had chosen to protect, as if it were a sacred duty. Emily leaned in, carefully checking their vitals one last time before nightfall. As she gently lifted the hind paw of the larger pup, she froze. Beneath the damp fur, a faint tattoo emerged, almost faded with time and cold injury. Her eyes widened. At that moment, the scattered fragments in her memory connected like a lightning bolt cutting across a dormant sky. She sat up straight and pulled out her phone from her coat pocket, scrolling through a folder of saved images from weeks earlier. She searched for a photo she had kept all this time, one that had once seemed meaningless. But now it was the key. It was a bulletin from veterinary and ranger networks. Missing, Kira, a state task force working dog, last seen after an ambush near the Northern Reserve. Pregnant, disappeared on December 4th. Kira, a specially trained service dog, skilled not just in narcotics detection and search and rescue, but revered for her unwavering loyalty to a handler who had died in a smuggling bust. When the team arrived at the scene, Kira had vanished. Everyone believed she had either perished or been abducted and sold by poachers. No trace had ever been found. Until now. Emily turned to Michael, her voice shaking with emotion. "Michael, I think I know who the mother of these pups is." He looked at her, eyes sharp with concern. She was a working dog. Her name was Kira. I was part of the search team when she went missing. No one ever found anything. We thought she was gone. Will re-entered from the porch, having just seen the ranger unit off. He caught Emily's last words and stopped, frowning. "You're sure?" Emily nodded, her eyes never leaving the two pups. "The tattoo on the hind leg, it matches. And she wasn't just any dog. Kira was trained to track exotic animal traffickers. If Max Harper's group had her, it's because they knew exactly how valuable she was. And now, I think they took her pups before she had a chance to recover." Michael's fists clenched. His rage didn't erupt. It sank deep, cold, and quiet. He looked at the puppies, not only abandoned but stolen from their mother for a vile reason. And worse, their mother might still be out there. Imprisoned, tortured, or worse, drained of all hope. Emily whispered, as if to herself, "If they're alive, then maybe Kira is too." Will stroked his chin, thoughtful. "I'll check the evidence we recovered tonight. If there's a leash, sedatives, or signs of exotic parasites, we'll have grounds to widen the investigation." Michael nodded slowly. "If there's even a chance she's alive, I'm going after her." Emily looked up at him, eyes quietly alight with belief. Buddy gently inched closer to the pups, resting his chin on their backs as if absorbing every word. Inside the cabin, with wind slapping the eaves and fire flickering in the hearth, a secret had been unearthed. Not just revealing a past injustice, but opening the door to a new journey. A journey to reunite a mother with her stolen children, to restore justice for a loyal four-legged warrior, and most of all, to fight for what was still worth saving. And so, once again, Michael stood before a choice that was far from easy. But this time, he knew. It wasn't just duty, it was the right thing to do. For justice, for the voiceless, and for the fragile belief in kindness that still glimmered, however faintly, in a cold and ruthless world. The news about Kira hit the cabin like a sudden gust of wind, scattering the quiet that had only just begun to settle after the storm. In the dim light of the fire, Michael sat silently by the window, his eyes scanning the deep forest outside, where layers of snow-covered trees stood like sentinels hiding truths yet unnamed. Meanwhile, Emily, now certain of Kira's identity, could no longer sit still. Her mind raced. An instinct forged from countless missions with rescue teams now intertwined with something deeper, a bond between a mother torn from her young and the fragile lives that had just escaped the edge of death. Will entered holding a bag of items confiscated from Max Harper's vehicle. He spilled them onto the table, a collar with a chip, a steel leash stained with old blood, a vial of tranquilizer for large animals, and a handwritten list with names encoded in symbols. Emily picked up the collar, fingers brushing over the inside lining. Scratches, cuts, and the lingering scent of antiseptic. She held her breath. "This is Kira's. I remember the stitch on the right seam. I sewed it myself after a border operation 2 years ago. It's her. I know it." Michael looked up, his voice firm. "Then we bring her home." Will nodded. "We need to plan it carefully. Fast, quiet, clean." He spread out a topographic map across the table. He circled a dense forest region near the western border of the state, an area previously tied to rumors of illegal dog training camps and suspicious animal transport activity. According to last night's arrest records, Max Harper had been under observation before, but never caught in the act. If Kira was alive, this was the last place she might be. "We're not just rescuing Kira," Will said, eyes scanning the map. "We could be taking on an entire network." Michael's hands curled into fists. "If it's a network, they'll have guards, weapons, cages, and traps. We hit the heart, fast, precise, no warning." Emily was quiet for a long moment. Then she looked up, eyes sharp with purpose. "I'm coming with you." Will blinked. "Emily, this won't be like field medicine or hiking. It could get dangerous." But she stood firm. "I know how to calm a panicked dog. I can assess injuries faster than anyone. If Kira's alive, she'll need someone who doesn't smell like fear or gunpowder. She'll need someone who can look her in the eye and give her a reason to trust." Michael studied her for a long beat. Then he nodded. "Then we plan tonight." Will marked the approach route, a frozen creek winding through the southern edge of the forest, leading to a narrow trail through low hills. They would split into 2 teams, Michael from the forest flank, and Will and Emily from the creek. None would carry lethal weapons, but they'd have signal lights, radios, and safety leads to guide any freed dogs out. Buddy would stay behind at the cabin with the 2 puppies, now given temporary names, Scout and Luna, a gesture of anchoring them to something stronger than abandonment. They had begun to respond, turning their heads gently at the sound of their names, and Buddy hadn't left their side for even a moment. Before nightfall, Michael stood on the porch, eyes fixed toward the horizon, where Kira might be, locked away in frost and shadow, waiting for a miracle. But he didn't believe in miracles, not the kind that just appears. He believed in the kind made by action, by resolve, by people who refuse to let what's right be buried in silence. Emily stepped outside, handing him a worn photograph, Kira beside her late handler. "You'll need her to see that you're not the enemy." Michael took it and nodded. In his hand, the photo felt heavier than anything he'd carried in war. And as night fell once again, 3 people, each bearing old wounds, each driven by a different purpose, began to prepare for a journey not just to rescue a dog, but to reclaim justice, compassion, and the fragile flame of life waiting to be defended, even if it had been forgotten in the deep and the dark. Just as the rescue plan for Kira began to take shape, the sky shifted. Thick banks of gray clouds rolled down from the northern mountains, sinking low like colossal walls of ice pressing slowly along the forest's edge. The wind rose, first a whisper through pine needles, then a wild, whirling force, as if the ancient forest itself was breathing in icy screams. Michael stood on the cabin's porch, coat pulled tight, shielding his eyes as he looked toward the frozen creek where they planned to cross at dawn. But what he saw wasn't the familiar path. It was a thickening white curtain, growing heavier by the minute. The first flakes had drifted like powder. Now they churned in heavy sheets, spinning into small, fierce cyclones across the mountain slope. Will stepped up behind him, face grim. "The Rangers just updated their report. The storm's moving faster than forecast. Level 4 alert. If we head out now, we might not survive long enough to reach the forest's edge." Michael said nothing. He tightened his grip on the porch railing, eyes locked on the white void swallowing the view ahead. Inside the cabin, Emily was tending to Scout and Luna with steady, gentle hands, the rhythm of her care like a quiet breath in an otherwise fragile world. She had just finished rewrapping Luna's paw and whispered soft reassurances as she worked. At the sound of the wind shrieking outside, Scout flattened his ears and pressed into Buddy, seeking warmth and shelter. Buddy didn't speak, but the way he lay still, eyes open, nose resting first on Scout's head, then Luna's, that was language Michael didn't need to teach. A silent pledge that said, "I'm here, I won't let go." Emily looked up as Michael stepped back inside, his hair tousled by the wind, cheeks flushed red from the cold. Her eyes locked on his face, quiet, intense, and holding more calculation than usual. "We can't go," he said, softly but firmly. "Not tonight." Will nodded, placing more dry wood by the fire. "If we're lucky, the storm will pass in 48 hours, but this cabin only has enough supplies for 2 days, and the temperature's dropping faster than expected." The room grew still. No one needed to say more. They all understood. This time the threat didn't come from men, but from nature itself. Silent, merciless, and impossible to negotiate with. Michael fed more logs into the flames, the soft amber light spreading across the room, casting their shadows on the rough timber walls. Will lined the drafty door frames with extra cloth, and Emily checked every layer of blanket and each warm water bottle tucked around the puppy's nest. In a moment that seemed fleeting but lingered long, the three of them, and Buddy, paused, their eyes meeting in an unspoken bond. They weren't family. They weren't lifelong comrades. But they were here, together, deep in the forest, in a night that could break anyone left to face it alone. And in the heart of that freezing place, it was those two fragile lives sleeping gently in an old pile of blankets that had bound them together. 3 people from 3 different worlds, now united in a single resolve, to endure for the sake of life. Scout let out a small whimper, like a sob from a dream. Luna tucked her legs under herself, snuggling deeper into Emily's arms. She leaned down and whispered like a lullaby, "Sleep now. I won't let you get lost again." Michael watched her. He was no longer just the lone veteran in hiding. He was now part of a new kind of unit, where courage wasn't measured by firepower, but by endurance, by trust, and by the ability to hold on to warmth in the coldest of nights. The wind still howled through the trees. Snow still fell, thick and endless. But inside the cabin, the fire still burned, Buddy still kept watch, and a silent promise was being held. When the storm passed, they would go on, not just to find Kira, but to protect every life still waiting for a chance to live, to return, and to be loved as it deserved. Outside the cabin, the wind howled through the pines like echoes from an ancient world, each gust slamming against the wooden roof, making the walls tremble slightly. Snow fell thick and unrelenting, blanketing the night sky in white, as if time and sound were being buried under the weight of winter's silence. But inside that small room, the fire still burned, slow and warm, like a quiet breath trying to keep life alive through the harshest cold. Emily sat by the fireplace, her hands resting gently on the sleeping forms of Scout and Luna, curled into their nest of blankets. Buddy lay close, eyes never straying far from the pups, occasionally dipping his nose to sniff them softly, just to make sure they were still safe. At that moment, Michael approached, holding a cup of hot tea brewed from some dry mint leaves he'd found in his father's old kitchen drawer. He set it down near Emily and sat beside her, saying nothing at first. The firelight flickered across both their faces, highlighting weariness, but not the kind born of defeat. The silence between them no longer felt distant. It was more like a soft blanket shared between 2 people learning to sit close again. Michael spoke first, his voice low and hoarse, like the wind murmuring through the cabin walls. "I used to think I had nothing left to lose." Emily tilted her head slightly, eyes on him, but said nothing. She knew some pain didn't need prompting, only room enough to surface. "When I came back from the war," he continued, "I still had my wife, and a home. Anna was everything. Softer than autumn, stronger than anything I'd ever known. But the accident came too fast. Just one bad turn from the car in front. No warning, no last words." He paused, gripping the edge of his coat as if holding on to something that still refused to let go. Emily reached out and placed her hand over his. She didn't speak. The warmth of her touch was a different kind of wind, not cold, not wild, but soft, threading itself into the space he'd kept empty for so long. Michael gave a faint laugh, more like fog than sound. "I disappeared into the forest with Buddy, like I was running from something. But it turns out you can't run far enough. I still see her in my dreams, always reaching out, never close enough." Emily didn't let go. She gently squeezed his hand, as if trying to pass a heartbeat into his words. "I understand," she said quietly. "Not the same, but I understand. I lost someone too. His name was Noah. He was a vet, like me. My colleague, my partner. We started our first rescue shelter together. We planned to retire someday with a pack of old dogs. Live quietly after it all." She drew a breath. "But he died in a wildfire, trapped while trying to save one last dog. Everyone called it heroic. I just called it helpless. I should have gone with him." This time it was Michael who held her hand in return. In that small space filled only with firelight and the soft breathing of sleeping pups, two people sat side by side, each carrying a scar no one could see, but finding, in each other, a rare kind of understanding. Buddy rose, lifting his head to look at them, then nestled himself between them, as if to close the final space with his body. Emily chuckled gently, rubbing his ears. "He knows when everything needs a moment of stillness," she said. Michael looked at Buddy, then at Scout and Luna, still curled in sleep. "He lost his whole unit once, back when he was a service dog. That's why I took him in. Maybe that's what we all are. Survivors, just trying to reclaim the pieces we've lost." Their eyes met, not with promises, not with expectations, but with a quiet honesty built from what had already been broken. And sometimes, healing doesn't come from something new. It comes from sharing what's been shattered. Outside, the storm still howled. But inside that cabin, for the first time in a long while, the warmth wasn't just from the fire. It came from people, from listening, and from something small yet priceless: understanding. After Michael and Emily's conversation faded into quiet, the cabin seemed to soften with them. The fireplace burned on, casting a warm, honey-hued glow across the wooden walls, bathing the space in light that was soft, steady, and gentle. Outside, the snow kept falling, thick and silent, covering every trail, every branch, every door of the old forest. At times the wind screamed. At others it held its breath, leaving the little cabin to glow like an island of light adrift in an endless sea of white. Michael sat beside the blanket nest where Scout and Luna lay. His large, calloused hands gently touched their fur, now fully dry and warm again after days of care, holding the breath of life itself. Scout was asleep, but no longer in the restless way he had at first. He breathed deeply, steadily, his belly rising and falling like a quiet rhythm of peace. In his dreams, his legs twitched, and now and then he gave a soft growl, not from fear, but as if dreaming of open fields, an open door, or a familiar voice he longed to hear again. Luna was curled tightly next to Buddy, her small head resting on the older dog's thick neck, seeking shelter in the safest place she knew. Her amber eyes were clearer now, not clouded or dull as when she was first rescued. And today, for the first time, Luna had walked, just a few clumsy steps, but enough to cross the room and nuzzle her head gently into Michael's knee. She didn't bark, didn't whine. She simply came to him, drawn to the warmth that had saved her from the brink of death. Michael hadn't moved for a long time afterward. He sat frozen, afraid that if he so much as shifted, the moment might vanish. That feeling, the trust of a fragile creature freely given, was like medicine he never knew he'd been missing. After so many years on the edge of pain and endurance, for the first time, he felt something crystal clear. He still mattered. Emily sat nearby, saying nothing. She knew words weren't needed now. Just presence, still and attentive, as they bore witness to each small sign of life returning. She had seen hundreds of animals recover, but something about Scout and Luna stirred a different emotion in her. Not just because they'd been found in brutal conditions, but because their healing wasn't only medical. It was a journey of trust, of resilience, and, above all, of unconditional love. Even Buddy, the old soldier, had changed. Since Scout and Luna were brought in, he had barely left their side. When Luna burned with fever, Buddy had pressed his body to hers, giving his warmth. When Scout whimpered from hunger but couldn't stand, Buddy nudged the bowl toward him with his nose. No commands, no training, just instinct. But maybe that was healing too, not just for the pups, but for Buddy himself. Perhaps for the first time in a long while, he had someone to protect again. That night, Michael didn't sleep. He sat beside the nest, watching the two small lives dream, then looked toward the fire, flickering quietly like a second heartbeat in the room. Slowly, his old memories began to soften. Images of Anna, his wife, once his whole world, returned gently. No longer a weight tearing him apart, but a warm ache. He imagined her smile. She would have been proud, knowing that these two lives were saved by hands that once thought they could save nothing. At first light, when the snowlight crept softly through the frosted windows, Emily approached and laid a hand on Michael's shoulder. He looked up. She didn't ask anything. But Michael spoke first, his voice unusually calm. "I didn't think I'd ever feel this again. The feeling of being alive and needed." Emily gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze. "You deserve it, Michael. Not just because you saved them, but because you didn't turn away when they chose you in return." Michael looked over at Scout and Luna. Scout stretched with a lazy yawn, then leaned over to lick Buddy's nose. A silent thank you. Luna tottered out of the blankets and settled quietly at Michael's feet. She made no sound, made no demands. She was just there. Her presence was the answer to every doubt he'd ever had. And Michael smiled, gently, a real, full smile for the first time in many years. In that tiny wooden cabin deep in the snowy forest, a miracle had taken place, without magic. Just a small dog placing her head on his leg, a quiet lick, a gaze full of trust, and that was enough to change a man's life. They didn't speak, but they taught him the most important truth. Sometimes salvation isn't about who we heal, but when we allow ourselves to be needed. And Michael needed Scout and Luna as much as they once needed him. Tomorrow, danger still awaits. The storm had not fully passed, and Kira was still somewhere out there, trapped on the edge of survival. But today, in this simple moment, the little cabin had become a beating heart again, for people, for dogs, and for all who believe that kindness, no matter how small, can thaw even the deepest winter. When the first light of dawn spilled gold across the snowy cabin roof, carrying with it the faint warmth of a distant spring, Michael stood silently by the window. Scout and Luna were curled deep in their blankets, sound asleep, guarded as always by Buddy's tireless watch. The morning light touched the faces of these small, healing creatures like a gentle reminder. It was time. He turned to Emily and Will, his companions, now more than just allies, and nodded once. No words were needed. They were ready, not just out of duty to a service dog lost to poachers, but because, in their hearts, Kira was no longer a mission. She was a soul who deserved to come home, just like Scout and Luna had. Their chosen path was an old trail, barely marked, weaving through the western ridge of Snow Ridge Forest, suspected to be a key point in Max Harper's trafficking ring. The maps they carried were rough, pieced together from memory and scraps of old intel. But Michael, once a scout who had crossed enemy forests under fire, didn't rely only on maps. He carried determination. Emily took the middle, carrying 3 packs: veterinary gear, sedatives, medical supplies, and an emergency locator. Will brought up the rear, a compact sidearm slung over his chest, ready, but not aggressive. They moved fast, silent like shadows cutting through the white woods. After nearly 3 hours, they reached a fenced compound of rusted steel wire. Inside, dark military-style tents stood crowded beside large iron kennels. A few figures in heavy jackets moved between them. No uniforms, but sharp, practiced movements. These were handlers, not caretakers. Michael signaled a halt. From his coat, he pulled a small surveillance mic, an old device from his recon days. If planted near a kennel, it would capture audio, enough to justify a legal raid. But time wasn't on their side. Kira could be hurt or already prepped for transport. Emily whispered, "If she hears a familiar voice, she might respond." "Michael, do you think she'll remember?" He nodded. "She will." They skirted the perimeter, hugging trees and dense shadows, until they reached the rear of a large shack. Inside, a chorus of barking rang out, sharp, chaotic, muffled by walls. But beneath it, a low, broken whine repeated. Short, deep, a pulse of pain. Emily froze. "It's Kira," she whispered. "She's inside." Michael slipped along the outer wall, finding a narrow gap between old boards. What he saw clenched his chest. A German shepherd, caged alone. Thin, limpio, one ear drooping, a leg wrapped in dirty gauze, but her eyes, bright, snapped upward at the sound of footsteps. And when Michael called gently, "Kira, it's me, Michael, we're here," she stood, trembling, unsteady, but alive, her eyes flooded with recognition. She let out a strangled whimper of joy and pain. Her tail thumped wildly, flinging blood onto the cold floor. Will unlatched the cage. Emily rushed in first, assessing. Compound fracture, infected but not septic. Reflexes strong. She's still fighting. We have time. But before they could lift her out, a shout rang out behind them. "Stop!" 3 men burst from the main tent. One of them Harper's old second-in-command. He raised a pistol, eyes wild. "Step back! That dog is our property!" Michael stepped forward, voice clear and unflinching. "She's a national service dog. You're committing a felony." The man scoffed. "There's no law here, and I don't care who she used to be." Will raised his weapon, calm and steady. "I'm with the State Forest Service. You're being recorded. Any resistance from here on is criminal obstruction." Everything froze. Between the iron cages and the biting wind, tension crackled. Then Kira growled. Not weak, not scared, a deep, defiant snarl. She stood on 3 legs, body trembling but eyes blazing. Scout, Luna, and Buddy, miles away, seemed to feel it too. The man flinched. In Kira's eyes, he saw something raw. Survival. And he knew, one more step forward, and he wouldn't just be facing guns. He'd be facing the judgment of the forgotten, those who had every right to fall, but never did. Police and forest officers arrived minutes later, summoned by the emergency beacon Will had triggered. The operation was shut down, arrests made, and Kira, finally, was carried out of the shadows. On the ride home, Kira lay in Emily's lap, head resting on the shoulder of the woman who once stitched her wounds long ago. Michael drove in silence, one hand resting behind the seat, where Scout and Luna sat pressed together, eyes fixed on the road ahead. As the cabin came into view, dawn poured through the trees, catching the scar on Kira's leg, a scar that would never fade. But it didn't speak of pain. It bore witness to the fact that she survived, that she was brought home, because someone believed every soul, no matter how lost, deserves to be found. And for the first time in years, Michael whispered, not just to Kira, but to himself, "We brought someone home." When Will's pickup truck rolled to a stop beside the cabin porch, the sky had shifted into a soft shade of lilac, twilight descending gently over the forest. The snow had finally stopped. The pines swayed lightly in the wind, as if the forest itself was exhaling after the storm's long, harsh hold. No one in the vehicle moved right away. In the back seat, Kira lay still, her head resting on Emily's lap. Though her eyes still showed exhaustion, a new kind of light had taken hold, the light of someone finally going home. Michael stepped out first, then gently helped Emily and Kira down. He said nothing. His hands were steady, firm yet tender as he lifted the weakened dog from the seat, like cradling a piece of his heart, found again after being lost for too long. Buddy was already standing by the door, posture alert and taller than usual, having sensed a familiar scent even before it reached the cabin. And behind him, As if pulled by some invisible thread of instinct, Scout and Luna emerged clumsily from their nest, ears perked, noses twitching rapidly, eyes wide and shimmering with something unnameable, something deep from the fragile corners of memory. Emily knelt and gently lowered Kira onto the snow just outside the cabin. Kira wobbled, unsteady on her 3 legs, her head tilting slightly as her ears trembled. Listening. Scout stepped forward first. He moved slowly, stopping midway as if afraid this might be a dream that would vanish if he got too close. Luna followed behind, cautious, tail down, but her gaze never left Kira. And then, a soft sound escaped Scout's throat. A whimper, deep and trembling. Not a greeting, not a cry, but something remembered. Kira took 1 step forward, her whole body quivering. She bent her head down, drawing in the scent from the 2 tiny souls before her. And then, like a melody long interrupted now being played from the very note it left off, Kira let out a low whine and leaned in to gently lick Scout's forehead. Luna broke into a run. No more hesitation, no more fear. She pressed her face into her mother's chest, burying herself as if terrified she might lose her again. Kira wrapped her neck around her in return, unsteady but tender, a quiet circle of breath and fur and touch. In the fading light, surrounded by snow, the 3 bodies curled into each other, fur against fur, breath joined with breath, no words, no sounds, just a reunion that language could never capture. Michael turned away, but the tears came anyway. A single drop traced the sun-hardened lines of his soldier's face. This man who had seen war, death, and things that silence a person for life. But here, at this moment, a gentle lick, a trembling embrace, a mother reunited with her young. This was what cracked his heart, wide open. Emily raised a hand to her mouth, stifling the sob building in her chest. She had witnessed countless births and endless goodbyes between pets and their owners, but never had a reunion cut her so small. Maybe because a mother's love, especially a dog's, needs no words, no proof. It just appears, raw and whole, when the lost are found. Buddy approached but didn't intrude. He stood quietly behind Kira, bowing his head in respect. Though they had never met, they seemed to understand each other in a way that had nothing to do with time or speech. Both had protected these fragile lives with all the instinct life had given them. A second later, Kira turned, locking eyes with Buddy, and instead of barking, she lowered her head and gently touched her nose to his cheek. A simple gesture, but one that carried every unspoken thank you. Michael knelt beside them, 1 hand on Kira's back, the other stroking Scout's head. He whispered, voice cracked with emotion. You're home now. They have their mother again. And you're not alone anymore. In the golden light falling through the tall pines, the cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was a home, a place where broken spirits found each other, where loss became life again, and where trust, once shattered, had begun to mend in silence. Scout curled tightly into his mother, eyes closed. Luna dozed against her chest, breathing deep, like dreaming a dream she never dared believe. And Kira was no longer a tired soldier. In her children's arms, she was whole. She had found herself again, and more importantly, a place to belong. And in Michael's chest, for the first time in years, something bloomed. Quiet but strong. Maybe, just maybe, saving them was what had saved him too. As night fell once more, the Snow Ridge forest seemed still. Too still. After everything, it should have been a welcome calm. But Michael, a man who had lived too long in the survival instincts of a soldier, felt something else threading through the air. The silence wasn't natural. It was too tight, too breathless, like the entire forest was holding itself, bracing for something it knew was coming. Kira, resting beside Scout and Luna after their emotional reunion, no longer had her ears relaxed as before. They stood erect now, pivoting toward the window. Her deep brown eyes gleamed with alertness. Buddy wasn't lying still either. He slid low across the floorboards, quietly abandoning the blanket pile, his gaze fixed on the door like an old sentry catching the scent of war. Michael stepped onto the porch. The cold didn't make him flinch. What stopped him was the fresh tire track carved into the snow behind the cabin, right along the edge of the woods. He knelt, tracing the marks with his fingers. Clinging to the tread wasn't just snow. It was damp gravel, the kind found in the old quarry to the east, a place once used as a hideout by Max Harper's crew. Instinct never lies to a man who's survived hell. He slipped back inside, bolted the front door, and moved swiftly to the kitchen where Will and Emily were gathered. He didn't need to explain. One look was enough for Will to understand. Max hadn't given up, and this time he wasn't here to threaten. He was here to destroy. Michael spoke fast. "I need 10 minutes. After that, we take positions." Emily gripped his shoulder, her eyes tense and bright. "Can we hold them off?" Michael didn't answer, but his eyes said it all. "As long as I breathe, no one in this house will be touched." In under 7 minutes, the cabin was turned into a temporary fortress. Michael directed Will to lay thin wire at 3 blind spots outside the windows, rigging trip alarms with taut steel and tin cans hung high. Each misstep would create a loud clatter, enough to warn them someone was coming. He removed part of the back door, blocking the narrow hallway with a table. Buddy was positioned in the corridor, silent and alert. Kira, still not fully recovered, stood tall, every hair along her spine bristling like a blade. Her gaze no longer belonged to a wounded creature. It was the look of a mother ready to fight her last battle. Scout and Luna were tucked deep into the storage room, door bolted, layered in thick blankets to muffle the sound. Emily sat beside them, radio in hand, ready to assist if medical help was needed. She wasn't a soldier, but the calm she radiated, the steadiness of someone who'd held lives in her hands, made her unshakable. And then the darkness arrived. Tires ground against snow and ice, echoing through the trees like metal snapping under pressure. A black SUV with no plates crawled up the hill, stopping just short of the cabin, like a predator closing in on prey. Max Harper stepped out first. No mask this time. The scar from their last encounter split his face like a brand. Behind him were 3 more men, lightly armed but full of grim resolve. "Michael Brooks!" Max shouted, his voice slicing through the night. "You think saving a few dogs makes you a hero? You ruined my business. I've come to take back everything." Inside the cabin, Michael didn't reply with rage. He knelt beside Kira and whispered, "This is your home now, and you won't lose it again." Footsteps began circling the cabin. Suddenly, clang! One of the tin can traps crashed down, banging hard against the wood siding. Will aimed his flashlight through the window, catching a shadow darting past. Michael signaled. Then, a gunshot. The first bullet shattered the rear window, ripping through the silence like a scream. Michael slid into the hallway, gripping the Glock 9mm he had kept for exactly this kind of moment. Will returned fire. Not lethal, but straight to the attacker's knee. A scream rang out as the man fell, and Buddy lunged, locking onto his leg, holding fast with a thunderous growl. Max roared and charged the back, gun raised. But at that moment, Kira struck. She burst from the shadows, leaping with all the fury of a mother wronged. On 3 legs, she launched herself, teeth sinking into Max's wrist. His weapon dropped, and before he could react, Michael was there, bringing him down with a single, brutal move. Sirens pierced the night. Red and blue lights swept through the trees. The forest lit up with the pulsing strobe of justice. The forest rangers arrived, flanked by local police Will had contacted using a private frequency. Max and his men were cuffed and dragged away. The battle was over. Back at the cabin, Michael turned toward the doorway. Buddy lay by the entrance, eyes still open, waiting for another order that wouldn't come. Kira returned to Scout and Luna, her body sagging with exhaustion, but her eyes burned with pride. She had done what all mothers do, protect her children with everything left in her. And Michael, the man who once stood in fire and shrapnel, now felt his heart pounding harder than it ever had in war. Not for victory, but because the home they had built, this fragile makeshift sanctuary, had held firm, and inside it, lives once forgotten, once hunted, once trembling, now stood tall. The fight was over, but what remained was something Max Harper would never understand. Life cannot be bought, love cannot be stolen, and a home built with courage and trust is a fortress no one can tear down. As the flashing lights of the patrol cars disappeared into the forest, leaving behind the primal darkness and pristine silence of Snow Ridge after a night of chaos, Michael finally felt his body unravel, each muscle slackening as if carrying too much for too long. But something in him wouldn't let go. A weight pressed hard on his chest like stone, making his steps back toward the cabin slow and heavy, as if he already feared the truth waiting inside. When he opened the door, he found Emily kneeling beneath the cabin's yellow lamplight, hands pressed against a blood-soaked towel, her face tight with the focus as he'd never seen before. Will knelt beside her, holding the trembling body of a gray, furred dog. In the corner, Scout and Luna huddled, eyes wide with shock and fear. Too young to understand, but old enough to feel something had gone wrong. At the center of it all, lying on his side near the fireplace, was Buddy. The old, brave dog hadn't simply collapsed after the battle. No, he had dragged himself back to the pups, pushing forward with the last of his strength to shield them from the final stray bullet. A shot meant for no one, aimless and wild, but enough to slice through his leg and flank as he leaped in front of Scout, who had stumbled into the hallway. Michael froze. Then he dropped to his knees beside Buddy, and his hands began to shake. Worse than in any battle, any trench. He had held fallen comrades before. He had caught cooling bodies in his arms. But now, looking into Buddy's eyes, clouded with age but still burning with a warrior's flame, something inside him cracked. Emily looked up. Her voice was low but steady. The bullet didn't hit the heart, but he's lost a lot of blood. We have to keep him awake until dawn. If we don't— She didn't finish. Michael leaned in, pressing his forehead to Buddy's. No, Buddy, not now. We haven't gone to the lake yet this spring. You haven't taught Scout how to track in the forest. Not like this. Not yet. Buddy licked his cheek. Barely a whisper of movement, so faint it felt like wind. But that small touch shattered the last dam. Michael's tears came fast, raw, and wordless. He had kept himself frozen through every loss in his life. But not this one. Scout stumbled forward. Luna followed. They didn't bark, didn't whimper. They simply lowered their heads, touched their noses to Buddy's, then lay down against his wounded body, pressing into him, giving their warmth, their presence. At that moment, a strange warmth spread through the cabin. It wasn't from the fire. It came from something wordless and alive between the tiny lives and the old dog who had given everything to protect them. Emily whispered, "We have to keep him warm. Warm. His pulse is still there, but faint." Michael stripped off his coat and draped it over Buddy. His hand rested gently along the dog's spine, moving in slow, steady strokes. He was no longer a soldier, no longer a man hiding from the world in the woods. Right now he was a comrade, beside a warrior who had never asked for glory but had fought with his whole heart. Outside, snow began to fall again, but it was no longer fierce, no longer cutting, just soft flakes drifting sideways in the wind, like whispers from the ancient forest, sent in reverence to Buddy. A quiet thank you. Will turned away, unable to stop the thing in his throat from rising. For the first time, he let himself blink away what blurred his vision. Kira came forward. Though limping, her three-legged gait unsteady, she moved with resolve. She made it to Buddy's side, lowered herself, and touched her nose to his cheek, then rested her head against his neck, as if giving back the warmth he had once given her. No one spoke. The entire cabin held its breath, because in that stillness, every heartbeat to the same rhythm, the rhythm of love loyalty, and sacrifice. And Michael whispered into Buddy's ear, his voice rough, choked. "You protected what you believed in. No matter what happens now, you'll always be our hero." Buddy was still alive. Though his injury left him motionless for most of the day, his breathing had grown steadier, his eyes less clouded, and the faint lick he gave Michael's hand whenever he sat beside him was a whisper. "I'm still here. I haven't gone yet." And in that fragile space, the little cabin in the woods seemed to exhale, as if everyone inside was slowly learning how to hope again. But there was one thing no one said aloud, and yet everyone was thinking about it. The next morning, the sky was clearer than it had been in days. The sun rose earlier, and the snow had stopped for good. Michael stood alone on the porch, staring out at the distant pines emerging from the mist of winter. The wind brushed against his coat. Not cold, just enough to remind him that the season was shifting. And for wild creatures, that shift was a summons. The blood stirred, urging them toward freedom, toward the wilderness they were meant to reclaim. Kira stood behind him. She didn't bark, didn't make a sound. She simply walked, strong, steady on 3 legs, until she reached his side. Then she stopped. Inside the cabin, Scout and Luna were still asleep, curled against Buddy's side like 2 small tufts of fur nestled under an old but warm blanket. Michael turned to look at Kira. She had her head raised, ears alert, her eyes fixed on the forest like she was hearing something no one else could. A call from far away, from the place she was born, from where she once belonged. And Michael knew exactly what it was. Inside his chest, something tightened. These past days had been more than just a rescue mission. They had been a series of moments, a bond forged breath by breath, every time he woke and found those deep brown eyes looking at him with quiet trust. Every night, Scout had curled into his chest. Every time Luna wagged her tail just because she heard his voice. It was the first time he had believed he could belong to something. Not because of the past, but because of now. But he also knew that if he kept them, he would no longer be their savior. He would be the one holding them back from what they were meant to be. Kira needed the wild. She needed an open sky. She needed to teach her pups how to survive, the way she had learned, the way it had been passed down through generations. And Scout, Luna, they were no longer scared, no longer trembling at the sound of wind or leaves. They had started listening, reacting, remembering, like children on the cusp of becoming something more. Michael lowered his head, one hand resting gently on Kira's shoulder. She turned to meet his gaze. No fear, no pleading, just a quiet understanding. Something that crossed the barrier of language between humans and animals. He whispered, mostly to himself, "You found your way back, and now it's time I learn how to let go." He returned inside and sat beside Scout and Luna. They nudged into his hands, eyes wide and dark, sensing something was shifting. Michael stroked their ears, their coats now thick and strong after days of warmth and safety. "We've come a long way together, haven't we?" he said, a soft smile tugging at his lips, though his eyes had reddened. "Buddy's here. Emily and Will always be family if you need one, but your mom knows the way home, and she'll lead you to where you truly belong." Luna whimpered softly, pressing her cheek to his chest. Scout lay down flat at Michael's feet, not wagging his tail, just letting out a long sigh, like a silent embrace. And Michael, the soldier who had once stepped into battle without hesitation, felt his heart begin to crack. Not from loss, but from loving deeply enough to know that letting go can be its kind of courage. The farewell unfolded quietly beneath the crystal-clear light of that midday. Will and Emily stood by the cabin, saying nothing. Michael walked the mother and her pups to the forest's edge. Buddy, though unable to follow far, lifted his head from the cabin window, his eyes not filled with regret, but with pride. Kira stepped forward first, her head held high. Scout followed. Then Luna. All 3 turned back once, just once, to look at Michael. the man who had pulled them back from the edge of life and death, who had given them a home, and now had given them the chance to return to where they truly belonged. Michael stood there, his hand brushing lightly against the old scar on his left wrist, a remnant of war, of pain, of the past. But today, it didn't feel heavy. Today, he had learned the greatest lesson of all. True love doesn't cling. True love lets those we love walk free when they're ready. And in the forest, where the wind whispered through the trees, the sound of their steps slowly faded, then disappeared into the vast, endless green. Michael closed his eyes, and at the corner of his lashes, a single tear fell, not from sorrow, but from freedom in letting go. The late winter forest wind swept across the wooden porch, not as bitter as when Michael first found the two fragile lives by the roadside, but still cold enough to cast a delicate sense of transience over everything. Faint sunlight filtered through thin clouds, painting soft streaks of light across the cabin floor as if time itself had slowed down by a beat. The cabin door opened, this time not to welcome anyone in, but to let them go. Michael stood silently in the doorway, arms relaxed by his sides, eyes fixed on Kira's every movement. She walked slowly toward the threshold without being urged. She moved like a warrior still bearing wounds, yet her eyes were steady and full of strength. Beside her, Scout and Luna followed quietly. Not the feeble creatures once huddled beneath a frozen tree, but young lives who had learned to walk on their own feet. Buddy lay inside, not trying to get up, yet his gaze never left them. When Scout stretched forward one last time toward Buddy, their noses touched gently. No sound, no excessive gesture, just a single touch carrying the bond they had forged from their earliest, weakest days. A silent goodbye between two generations of guardians. Michael knelt, arms open wide. Luna came first, pressing her head into his hand, her tail wagging slowly. He wrapped both arms around her, holding her for a long time, then whispered something into her ear. Words only the two of them would know. Scout followed, not wagging his tail, just staring at Michael for a long time. That look nearly took Michael's breath away. It was too much like the look of young soldiers he once had to send off to war, those who didn't know if they'd return, yet still managed to smile. Finally, it was Kira. She didn't step forward. She stopped at the cabin porch and turned to look back at Michael. No words, no pleading eyes, just a moment of profound silence, where both understood each other to the core. He bowed his head, hand tightening gently on the wooden door frame. "Take them," he said hoarsely. "Teach them what I cannot, and my love will always remain." Kira bowed her head, then slowly turned away. There were no howls, no barks, only the sound of footsteps, soft as wind on fallen leaves, echoed through the forest like a distant melody of farewell. Emily stood behind Michael, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. She said nothing. She didn't need to, because sometimes the most moving part of saying goodbye isn't in tight hugs or tears. It's in the quiet acceptance that those we love must continue on their path. Will approached from afar, placing a hand on the cabin wall, speaking softly, "They'll be all right, and they'll always remember the way back if they need to." Michael nodded, eyes still following the silhouettes of the three as they faded behind the pine trees. Their tracks on the snow slowly filled with the melting light of the setting sun, then disappeared. He exhaled slowly, gently closing the cabin door, not closing a memory, but opening a new way of living. Because in the end, he understood, that kindness isn't just about saving. It's also about knowing when to let go. Not because the love is gone, but because it's strong enough to set them free. And in that quiet, Michael whispered, as if to himself, as if to the whole forest, "Go, but if someday you come back, this will still be home." As the last footprints faded into the distant forest, Michael stood silently at the cabin porch, as if unable to look away from what had just happened. No more silhouettes in sight. Only the rustling wind through pine leaves, the last rays of sunlight piercing the trees, and the gentle chill of winter brushing his cheek like a whispered farewell from nature itself. The forest had taken back Kira, Scout, and Luna, but not cruelly, not like the day he found them. This time it was a return, a complete departure, timely, rightful, and dignified. Michael didn't cry. Inside, a quiet emptiness had opened up, and instead of filling it with sorrow, he let it fill with meaning. He knew that if he kept Kira and the pups merely out of attachment or affection, he would be going against everything he'd fought to protect. Their freedom, their instincts, their future. True love is not in holding tight, but in knowing when to release, so what's precious can return to its purest form. Kira had gone, taking with her the pups Michael once cradled in his hands, once tucked under blankets, stayed up all night to keep warm, spooning milk to them when they trembled like young leaves in ice. But now, with their leaving, he didn't feel the same helplessness he had in years past, when he lost his wife, lost direction, lost even himself. Instead, he felt healed. Not loudly, not heroically, just a slow, gentle healing, starting from Scout's final glance back, from Luna's nuzzle into his chest, from Kira's footsteps in the snow, no longer heavy with fear or pain. Buddy still lay by the window, his gaze steady, as if he understood it all. Michael walked over, sat beside him, and gently rested his hand on the old friend's back. This silent warrior who had fought without words, sacrificed quietly, and protected selflessly. Buddy let out a soft whine as if to say, "I know, and I too am letting them go." Emily made a hot cup of tea and set it on the wooden table. She said nothing. She sat by the window, eyes on the forest, hands clasped as if praying for peace for the 3 little lives that had just left. Will stood further back, binoculars in hand, though he didn't lift them to his eyes, just held them as a habit, a symbol that he was still watching over them, even if no one asked him to. Michael looked around the cabin. The old blanket of Scout and Luna still carried the scent of soft fur. Their water bowls were still full. Tiny, muddy paw prints still marked the corner of the room. He didn't clean them up. He didn't want to erase those familiar traces in haste. Because they didn't bring pain. They reminded him that sometimes, even a brief presence can change a life forever. He stood and opened the window. The wind poured in, carrying the cool, earthy scent of the forest, the smell of pine resin. And in one fleeting moment, Michael thought he heard a bark in the distance. Faint, far off, like a promise that maybe one day they would return. But even if they never did, he wouldn't be sad. Because what needed to happen had happened. What needed protection had been returned to where it belonged. And what needed healing had begun to heal. In Michael's heart, a new door gently opened, not to shut the past, but to step forward. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was just surviving. He felt like he was truly living, with a love that had outgrown loss. And as the sunset settled over the trees, he thought, some goodbyes aren't endings. They're the beginnings of something deeper, no longer present, but forever here. As winter quietly withdrew from Snow Ridge, leaving the last patches of snow melting by the wooden steps, Michael realized that the silence in the cabin was no longer loneliness. It was a gentle space for new things to sprout. Indeed, from that cold earth, an idea was quietly growing, nourished by memories, sacrifice, and unconditional love. Months later, beneath the lush green canopy and the vast sky seemingly welcoming something new, Michael, Emily, and Will stood side by side, eyes fixed on the ground where a wooden house was gradually taking shape. Beneath the newly erected sign was a hand-carved inscription, Buddy's Home, a place of healing for both humans and dogs. They chose that name not only to honor the old dog who once guarded the cabin threshold, ready to take a bullet for the little lives he protected. Buddy, through his quiet, steadfast dedication, represented what they wanted to build, a true home, for veterans who lost their way after leaving the battlefield, and for service dogs once deployed but now abandoned. "Buddy showed us something many humans forget," Emily softly said on the day they laid the cornerstone. "That loyalty never speaks, but it can save a soul." Michael nodded, feeling more at peace than ever before. Once a man who avoided the world, he was now helping create a place where people like him, scarred, burdened with memories and hope, could reconnect with themselves through non-judgmental eyes, wagging tails, and steady breathing beside the fireplace each night. Will took on coordinating with the police department and Veterans Affairs to bring K9 dogs to the center, including those injured or retired for not meeting standards. To him, every life that served deserved a second chance. And if anywhere could be a fresh start, it was here. Buddy's home was more than a shelter. It was a mutual healing journey. It was where veterans rediscovered meaning in caring for, training, and bonding with dogs. It was where discarded dogs were restored, loved, and sometimes adopted into new families as irreplaceable members. Michael did not build this place as a charity. He built it to return what Kira, Scout, Luna, and Buddy had given: the ability to love again, the ability to trust again, and above all, the ability to live without running from the past. One afternoon, while the first coat of paint was still drying, Michael stood on the new wooden steps, looking out over the old forest. From afar, the trees stood silent, rustling only when the wind passed by. But in his heart, it was no longer a lonely forest. He thought he heard familiar footsteps, soft, deliberate, gliding over fallen leaves. Not a hallucination, but the vivid memory of what had started it all. And in that moment, he whispered something no one else could hear. "Thank you, Buddy. Because of you, we have begun again. Not from the start, but from where the broken heart once was." His smile was gentle and deep. His eyes, once stormy, now shone with the soft light of a man who had finally found a reason to live, not just for himself, but for something bigger than pain. And so in that pine forest, a house was built, of wood, rough hands, and unconditional love. A new beginning, quiet and humble, yet strong enough to hold all the lost souls and bring them home. Late afternoon gently descended on the valley, the last sunlight stretching like a thin layer of honey over the earth. In the wide yard before Buddy's home, happy barks blended with lively footsteps, creating a vibrant symphony Michael never thought his heart would listen to with such peace. On the grass, a light gray German shepherd chased a rubber ball, tumbling awkwardly but springing up with determination. Nearby, a silver-haired veteran leaning on a cane laughed heartily as the dog leaped into his lap as if they had been lifelong friends. Further away, two little girls, the daughters of a female veteran who once suffered from depression, played with a once-abandoned Labrador, rolling together under the bright afternoon sun, their laughter like pieces of a dream now pieced back together. Michael stood on the porch, holding a cup of tea, his gaze never leaving those moments. Beside him, Emily gently rested her head on his shoulder, her arm softly slipping around his elbow. A silent message. "We have come this far together, and we are staying." She wore an earth-toned knit jacket, her long hair tied back, eyes sparkling not just with sunlight, but with the faith of having found a safe harbor. They needed no words. Their presence together was the most beautiful answer to all the brokenness of the past. Michael's gaze settled on Buddy, now walking slower but still steady. The old dog lay by the steps that he had silently guarded through many winters. Today, Buddy no longer strained to be a protector. He simply lay there quietly, watching the pack live fully in happiness. And Michael knew Buddy understood. His battle had come to an end. A gentle breeze blew, carrying the scent of pine wood, freshly cut grass, and somewhere, a familiar whisper from far away. Michael closed his eyes for a moment. He thought he heard Scout's footsteps on the wooden floor, Luna's soft whines when the cold came, and Kira's calm bark, short, powerful, but full of love. He didn't know if they were still somewhere in the forest, but he knew clearly. They were forever in his heart, not as memories but as a living part of him, for without those lives, he wouldn't have found himself again. Emily gently squeezed his hand and looked up with a smile. "Are you happy, Michael?" He didn't answer right away. He just quietly looked out to the yard, where dozens of dogs played, where every step marked life and trust healed. Finally he nodded, voice low and slow as a prayer. "I think this is the meaning of life. Not where you arrive, but who you walk with and what you choose to hold on to." Far away, the sun slowly sank behind the pines, its light shifting to a soft amber glow. But inside Michael, for the first time in years, he no longer feared the dark. Because here, the light didn't come from outside. It came from within, from a heart once broken, now mended with love, sacrifice, and compassion. And when you live for something bigger than yourself, you don't just exist, you truly live. Perhaps the most moving part of this story isn't just the journey of rescuing abandoned dogs or fighting against evil, but how souls seemingly broken, both human and animal, heal together and start over together. From an old dog who took a bullet for his pack, from a veteran who once lived alone in the deep forest, to a home called Buddy's Home, where wounded hearts learn to love again, trust again, and live again. If you were in their place, would you have the courage to let go? To let a life return to its world? Even if you love it dearly. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share this video with animal lovers, and subscribe to our channel to not miss the next healing journey. Because kindness doesn't need to be loud. It always leaves an indelible mark.